Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's NoVA UX meetup. And thank you, Caitlin, for joining us this evening. We are welcoming Caitlin Abramson, a user experience architect and front-end developer at Whereoware, a UX consultancy in DuPont Circle, Washington, D.C. She's going to be leading us through a user research 101 workshop about getting to know our users. Welcome, Caitlin. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It's really exciting for us to be here. I'm going to be walking through a little bit about user research from start to finish. I'm hoping to make today a little bit more fun, and as Jim was saying, a little bit more of a workshop than just, educational slides and lecturing. We're going to go over the agenda in a little bit, but to get us started, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself and Whereoware just to kick us off here. So a little bit about me. I am a user experience architect and front-end developer at Whereoware. I graduated from UVA in 2020, and I've been working for LookThink ever since. LookThink is now known as Whereoware, and I have large experience in a variety of different sort of platforms and solutions for clients. But today, primarily, we're going to be talking about user experience research and how you can do it in all sorts of projects and on a budget. And a little bit briefly about Whereoware as well. We are a tech and design team that works for a large variety of clients and project types. And ultimately, our main goal is to just provide a better user experience from start to finish in whatever way our client needs. I've listed out some skills here that typically are involved in our project and client work. And obviously, the most important is user research and analysis. So a few people that we have worked with are listed out here. We tend to span industries and tech stacks. If you'd like to learn more, you can feel free to check out some of our case studies or blog posts about any of these clients that we have. So with that brief introduction to myself and Whereoware, I'm going to go ahead and get started into today's agenda and what we're going to be focusing on. So we're going to start with about the first half is going to be our portion of sort of that workshop experience. We're going to be running through some activities after an introduction as to what user research is. We're going to have a brief case scenario and sample questions, and then we're going to be refining those questions as we go. It's really during this half that it would be great to have cameras on and some interaction, but I also understand camera fatigue, and it is after a work day already. After this, we're going to have a quick Q&A break in the middle. This will be a nice little pause in sort of the workshop session, as well as an opportunity for you all to ask questions about anything we had discussed up to that point. After that, we're going to be going over data collection and analysis, as well as how to do all of this in a budget and how to convince your clients or key stakeholders that user research is a necessary value. And hopefully at the end, we have some time for another session of Q&A and general discussion. Just a brief note overall, in terms of participation, I'd always prefer conversation, unmute yourself, introduce yourself anytime that we have some sort of questions to answer and whatnot. And if you have questions to ask, you're more than welcome to do that during the Q&A breaks. However, if you have thoughts you'd like to share and you don't want to go off mute, feel free to put them in the chat. I will be moderating that as we go too. So really flexible however we want to do this. All right, so going in and getting started, because we have a lot to go over today, what are we going to be focusing on? User research is a really, really broad field, and there is just no chance that I will be able to go over this in 1 hour-long session today. So we're having to narrow it down a little bit. So what are we focusing on? Our main focus today is going to be user interviews, and really we're going to be covering a little bit of start to finish on what the user interview process looks like. We're going to be going over techniques for questions, how to prepare, the analysis and collection portion of the data, and then, as I mentioned before, that piece of working on a budget. We are going to be covering some subfields of user research and user interviews, such as usability testing, task analysis, and contextual interviews, but we'll just be mostly touching on those and talking about them, not in too much detail. What are we not covering today? There's plenty left in the field of user research that we will not be touching on. And some of those are highlighted here as other techniques. So that's A/B testing, focus groups, surveys. These are all really valuable and important in of their own right. And we will be briefly touching on them at the end. We just won't be talking about them in any great amount of detail. We also are not going to be going over exactly textbook perfect practices. I've now mentioned budget a bunch of times. Oftentimes that textbook perfect practice and policy is ultimately not going to fit into a whole bunch of projects and scopes that are out there. So we have to be really good at being flexible about what we can do. Everything that is being shared today is going to be based off of those principles and based off those practices, but just might not be one-to-one exactly what you'd read in a textbook. If you do want to look for that and you're beginners or even advanced, Nielsen Norman is a great source to use. They have books, they have websites. You can find a great amount of information that both dive deep and give you high level there as well. Okay, so why user research? Why are we here today? And why is it so important as a field in general? To start us off, we are going to be gaining deeper insight. So one-on-one user interviews are really valuable because of the time and exposure that you get to your end users. Because of that time, you're going to be getting observations and reviewing user answers that you might not otherwise have exposure to. And that's going to really be able to uncover the details that you want about the product at the end of the day. This is your opportunity to ask questions to the people that matter most. So take advantage of that. Next is increasing empathy. I'm sure everyone has heard the cheesy little saying of, put yourself in their shoes, and really user research is as close as you're going to get to that. The whole point of it is gaining empathy and understanding. And at first that might sound a little bit silly and not necessary, but really the more empathy and the more understanding that you have, the more you'll be designing for their needs accurately and holistically. This is really to learn from your users, and by expressing your desire to learn from them and listen to them, you're going to be building a better rapport with them and a greater trust, which is going to make the whole process a lot more seamless. Going off of increasing empathy, once you have more empathy and understanding, you're also going to be decreasing your bias. So if you're making decisions based off of what users truly want, you're going to be creating a more useful and relevant product. And you can also help check any preconceived notions that either you or key stakeholders might have at the start of the project. So this is a really great way for if you feel like you're being pushed by a stakeholder to go in a certain direction, to use this as a moment to say, let's see what the users want. And on that note, you're going to be then backing all your decisions in data. This might be the most impactful and important piece of user research, because design as a field is really, really subjective. By having your decisions backed in data, you're going to be spending less time arguing about opinions and more time discussing decisions rooted in facts. So you're going to be having focused and productive conversations, streamlined meetings and working sessions, and eventually at the end of the day, you're going to be having a stronger presentation to both your investors and key stakeholders, because you will have real data as to why you are suggesting the changes you are. So that's a little bit of a brief overview as to why user research is important, what is it, what we're going to be talking about today. As I said, it's a really big field. There's obviously way more about it than this, but this is sort of what we're going to be touching on today. So I need you guys to bear with me a little bit here. For some of our activities, we're going to be requiring a few Adlib type questions here to get us set up with a case scenario that we're going to be working with. As I said, feel free to unmute yourself and respond, or put something in the chat. I can have a couple answers, or I can just have one. But to get us started, what is a favorite or most important item for you? It can be anything. Any takers? You don't have to be shy. Oh,
I have a Yeti mug that I use a lot. Does that
Okay,
come
I hear Yeti mug. Okay, let's stick with that.
right there?
Great. And next,
Ah, well
we
done.
have your happy place.
The pool.
The pool. Okay, so you have Yeti mug and a pool is what we're going to be working with here.
That might
The
not
way
be-
that we're turning this into a little case scenario is we're going to pretend you've been hired by a client who's super excited about their next product idea, which is making a Yeti mug that you can use while you're floating in a pool at any point in time. This is going to be the next big hit. You're working within a tight budget. You don't have a lot of room for trial and error. And we're going to be working on user interviews in order to understand what is best needed for this product. All right, so to get us started, how are we going to start prepping for this? We need to start coming up with our questions. I like to bucket my questions in sort of two key areas, my background questions and my task-oriented questions. My background questions are the ones that I'm going to want to lead with. They're going to be a nice little introduction into the interview. It's going to loosen up your users. You're going to help start that conversation, get them talking. They may feel a little bit random or maybe less important when you first start doing this. I certainly had that feeling in the beginning, but really you're going to find that these questions help to provide key insight into who your users are, which goes back to that idea of understanding and increasing empathy. As a side note, I have here that it helps create user personas. We're not going to talk too much about that today, but that's another key user experience sort of theory and concept that we use when designing. So all these background questions can later feed into information into creating your personas. We have a couple examples here. I won't read all of them, but these are sort of just your questions that are going to be your vague general ones to start, and they can get a little bit more specific as you go. So a nice one to always ask is, what is your #1 like and dislike about the product? On the other hand, you're going to have your task-oriented questions. These are going to be always more specific and more direct. Task-oriented specifically can typically only happen when you have a pre-existing item. So in this case, Yeti mugs do exist. So you could talk to your users about, what happens when you bring your Yeti mug into the pool. Does it spill? Does it keep your temperature? Things like that can be asked specifically. But if a product doesn't exist, you can also always have, the what if scenario in there. Could you imagine what would happen in this situation? Things like that. At the very least, in each interview, you're going to want to have 1 to 3 specific measurable tasks. We're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but that's going to fall under this category here. And I've included some examples for you here too. So these are examples in terms of, typical websites or systems like that. So things that I always like to start with a website or an application is talking about navigation. When you first view the screen, what's the first thing you want to do? Do your navigation items make sense to you? What is something that you would want to interact with? So questions around that are a great place to start here. So our little activity is going to start with you all writing down at least 5 questions that you might want to ask our users about their use of a Yeti mug in a pool. So I will go ahead and get back to playing some music while we start this. Feels like I need to reload it every time I play it. Okay, just a few more seconds left, about 30 more seconds to wrap up any thoughts you might still have or any other questions you want to write down. Okay, perfect. So you're going to get back into things here. Before I go to the next slide, do I have any takers on volunteers to share any of your questions that you've come up with? Oh, yep. Henry, I see your hands raised. Oh, if you're talking, I don't think we can hear you. Or at least I can't. Uh-oh. Henry, do you want to put that in the chat? While we're waiting for Henry, does anyone else have anything that you want to share? Or pressure's on for Henry here.
Oh, volunteer, I got you in.
All right, Steve, thanks.
Mug thing. So why is just having a mug near the pool not good enough?
Awesome question. What type of question category would you put that in?
Yeah, I have no idea.
Okay, perfect. I would say that probably goes into like the background type question because you're still trying to understand maybe why they would want this in the first place, and it's not quite such a specific task. Henry's questions are now coming through, which his first one is, when you grab the Yeti mug, what's the first thing you want to do with this? So Steve gave us a perfect example of a background question, and Henry is giving us a great example of a task-oriented question, something more specific, something action-oriented. These are all awesome questions. So this is a really great starting point and a great place for you all to begin when you are first creating your question script and your guides. Just start writing down the first questions you have that come to mind. Then from there, you're going to want to think maybe a little bit more critically about what those questions are that you've written. So to start that, I did write some questions of my own in case I didn't have any volunteers, but thank you all for having volunteers. We don't need to go over these. So we're going to go back to 7th grade science for a minute here and use two terms that probably everyone here has heard maybe a few too many times in their life, which is qualitative versus quantitative data. This is really important for you to consider when you are writing questions because it's going to inform the type of data that you are collecting and what you're using at the end. So I'm going to make this quick because I do think that either most of you have already heard of these terms, or this is a concept that you all will quickly grasp. I'll have a little bit more detail in the slides, but we can skim over some of it here. But basically, quantitative data are things that are measurable. They're going to provide an objective way for you to answer a question, and they're going to be repeatable across users. So here are some examples, but basically anything that you can answer with a number or a yes, no, which you can think of as binary, like 1, 0, you know, anything like that is going to be a quantitative question, and you're going to be collecting quantitative data. You can think of these as your facts. On the other hand, you're going to have your qualitative data, which are going to be your feels. And these are going to rely on anecdotes and storytelling, and not unlike quantitative data, you're going to have coded answers. So that means you're going to have to be going through users' answers and pulling out the pieces that you want. Quantitative data gives you that one specific point to use and go with. And oftentimes this is very subjective. The questions here are things that we have kind of gone over the most already. So that sort of background type information. Some of those task-oriented ones can be qualitative as well. These are your why questions. These are prompting users to talk about their feelings or answer specific scenarios, what they would do. Both are really important to include and think about. I have some pros and cons listed out here. Which again, you all can dive into a little bit more in detail if you would like. But the most important part to take away here is that you want both types of questions, because on one hand, the quantitative data is telling you what a user does and gives you a really easy, measurable way for you to compare across all users how they're behaving. And on the other hand, qualitative data is going to provide that insight into why they're acting that way. So in order to get a really nice full picture, you're going to want to have both. So you guys can probably guess it, but we're going to take 2 minutes here to look at the questions that you've written down and see if you have quantitative and qualitative questions. See if there's a way you could make your qualitative questions more quantitative, or vice versa, or maybe you just need to add a few more questions in there. All right, we'll get back to the music. All right, 30 more seconds to wrap up any thoughts you might be having, any other questions you want to add. Okay, so gonna ask for some volunteers again, if people are willing, to go over any sort of question that they either made quantitative or something that they made maybe a little bit more qualitative. Do I have any takers?
I put some in the chat, but I said,
awesome.
have you, how many qualitatively do you ever worry about spilling drinks when you're in the pool? And the quantitative could be, how often do you worry about spilling drinks in a pool?
Perfect. Yeah, that's a really great example of the two different scenarios of asking a similar question. I also do have a side question at this point, which was, are there good or bad types of questions? Which is the perfect lead into our next section, which is all about bias in research. We have biases in everything that we do and everywhere we have, but user research is going to be no different than that. That doesn't mean we can't combat it though. A bias is basically any form of deviation from the truth in which data, from the truth in data, which then causes a false conclusion. There are so many different forms of biases. We absolutely cannot cover nearly all of them today. You could probably take a whole semester on biases alone, but I picked out 4 that are pretty prevalent, make a pretty big impact, and are pretty easy to avoid. So going back to that bad and good type questions, I would say no, there are no bad questions unless you're asking a biased question. So we have leading questions, which would fall into the category of a very bad question. And this is basically any sort of a question that is prompting a certain type of response. So an example here is, after interacting with your Yeti in the pool, how often are you feeling happy? This question might seem innocent, and you might want your users to be happy after interacting with them, and you might assume that they would be, but it is priming the users to think that they're going to have a positive reaction to this. That might not be their genuine reaction after it. So a different way you could phrase that is, how do you feel after interacting with your Yeti in the pool? Getting to the same point, just removing that extra bias. On the other hand, you have confirmation bias, which is something that you as a researcher can do, which is the tendency to take any sort of response that you get from your users and just use that to confirm something that you already thought. So in the beginning, we talked about leaving your preconceived notions about the product at the door. This is for confirmation bias. So an example is, maybe your user said, well, a Yeti in a pool, yeah, it could be better than it currently is. And you take that to mean he hates it. He didn't say he hates it, and hates is a pretty strong expression there. He just means it could be better. Maybe there are things he does like about it. But as soon as you internalize it to be like, oh yeah, my users do hate it, you're going to be skewing your results in a little bit of a too negative direction. Another effect that your users might have is the Hawthorne effect. And that's basically the desire to act in a way that is right. So they might even unintentionally change their behavior or express beliefs into something that they think might be what you're looking for. So that really ties in well with the leading questions, where, if you are leading them to think a certain way, so in this example, if you're leading them to think that they should be happy, they might positively answer the rest of their questions because they think you want them to be happy. And lastly, you're going to have some interviewer bias. And basically, this is when you express too many opinions and too much of an expression in response to your users' answers. Follow-up questions are fantastic. They are necessary. They are important. But follow-up questions with your feelings involved or not. So saying something like, oh, wow, like you didn't like the Yeti in the pool? That's really going to make your users second guess themselves, and they might feel self-conscious in the future to express anything that is opposing that expression. So these are some biases that kind of all tie really nicely together. A leading question can cause someone to answer in a way that they perceive as right or wrong. Then an answer like that could really feed into confirmation bias. You already led them to answer a certain way. Now you're taking their answer and being like, see, that did agree with what I originally thought. And then if you then respond with too much of an affirmation or a negative effect to what they say, that's only going to repeat the cycle all over again. So these are some things that you can be aware of. And how do we combat that? Well, there's some pretty easy steps for reducing bias. First thing is just simply acknowledging that you have a bias. Knowing that you're susceptible to it, knowing that we all have it, your users are going to have it, you're going to have it. This just helps you be aware of it, and this helps you to actively look for ways to reduce it. So one way to reduce it is to carefully review your questions before your interviews. So like we're doing here, we're going through multiple rounds of focusing on ways that you could improve your questions. Do that before you start your interview. Focus each round on a new thing, so you're putting dedicated focus into fixing certain parts of questions. Next, don't overshare or make too much side conversation. It can be You can really want to have that side conversation in the beginning, that small talk, but try to keep it as a minimum about sharing about yourself. You can always, make small talk and ask them how their day was, things like that. But, ultimately in user research, you're here to learn about the user, and the less you can share about yourself, the better. You can also limit your emotions, reactions, and opinions. This is really not about what you think or about, your shock at how a user is interacting with it. Users are probably already going to feel a little self-conscious in these interviews. You are observing their behavior. That is something that people get nervous about. So the less that you can respond to that in any sort of way, the better. Acknowledge their thoughts. You can sympathize with them a little bit to an extent, right? You can say, oh, wow, I understand your frustration, or like, I hear you on that, but don't let them know how you feel one way or another. Both step 3 and 4 are going to help reduce the Hawthorne effect and the interviewer bias. Step 5 is also going to specifically help to reduce the Hawthorne effect, which is stress the importance that there are no right and wrong answers. You really want to make sure that users understand that they are here because we want to learn from them. We want to learn about their likes. We want to learn about the things that they find frustrating, confusing. It isn't wrong if they are confused about a certain part of the system. It isn't wrong if they're interacting with it in a way that maybe wasn't intended. These are all important things for us to know. And then lastly, always ask those follow-up questions. You never want to assume. This is reducing confirmation bias. Obviously don't ask an excessive amount of follow-up questions because time is important to keep track of. But if there's an answer that you feel requires more of a conversation, more of a description, ask why. Why is the easiest question to follow up with. All right, so we are going to take 2 minutes now to look at what you've wrote and remove the bias within them. If you can't find any bias, I would challenge you to look again. And if you still can't find any bias, I would say, it's a good opportunity to come up with some follow-up questions that you could be ready to ask. Having those prepared ahead of time helps you to remove your emotional responses to their answers. So we're going to go ahead and get started again. It's very loud. All right, so we're gonna come back and ask one more time for a volunteer. And if you could share maybe an unbiased question and maybe what it was before. So share that before and after. Any takers?
Who's got a question they can share?
Sorry, what was that? You cut out in the beginning a little.
I was just asking who has a question they can share.
Yeah. If people are tired of sharing, that's okay. We can move on. We got a lot more to cover. But basically, you know, I think this is also the trickiest one. And it's the one that I think I get being a little bit more shy to share, but just taking the time to look through your questions and try to see where you might be leading them in a certain direction, try to think about them, take yourself out of the question and really try to feel how you would think if someone asked you that question. Okay, so now you've finished your questions and your rounds of revision, and you're pretty soon going to have a user interview guide created. So what is a user interview guide? This is basically a user interview script. I just prefer to call it a guide because it is helpful to my teammates and myself as a reminder that I can deviate from it as needed. You know, it's better sometimes to have more natural conversations and not as rigid of a structure to follow. If the user wants to talk about something that you hadn't thought of and it is relevant, follow that path. However, I do like to have a scripted introduction just to make sure that I'm really hitting all the important points that they need to know ahead of time. I then write out my questions, and one thing I do with each of my questions is I include a purpose so that myself and the note taker that I have with me understands why I'm asking this. This also helps to make sure I'm not asking any unnecessary or repeated questions. And then I have a conclusion where I include a few more high-level questions at the end. I always save time, even if it's just 2 minutes for a conclusion, because you really want to thank your users for their time. Let them know that they can follow up with you if they have any more information. And additionally, you can ask them for permission to have follow-up sessions or a way to reach out for them with more questions. On the slide here, this is a link. If you click on the image of the guide to a template that you all can use and download to work off of. Once you have a template set up, once you've done it once, learn from it, see what works, what doesn't, and reuse and repeat, right? Like save time and effort for yourself. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Okay, we're going to keep this a little bit short because I want to get through the rest of it, but I do want to pause here. This is sort of the end of the question part of writing, the writing question part of preparing for an interview, and I want to make sure no one has any questions.
I got one side question, Caitlin.
Okay.
I think I got this right. Is making assumptions a form of bias? So for instance, assuming someone has a pool or assuming someone has a Yeti mug.
I think it depends about what assumptions you're making. I think some assumptions are more dangerous than others, for sure. But I think in general, everyone knows the expression about assumptions. So I think try to keep them to the minimum anyway. Ask those follow-up questions as much as you can.
Great, thanks.
All right. Henry? I think you might still be having mic problems. So you might have to use the chat.
You can type, Henry, you can type into the chat.
All right. And anyone else have anything that we want to go over before we move on to the next sections?
How long do you typically expect interviews to last? Is there a sweet spot?
Yeah, great question. And this is something that at the end, I'll touch on a little bit too when we're talking about budgets. Typically, user interviews like this, one-on-one interviews are typically around an hour for that sweet spot of you're getting the most out of it, but you're not taking up too much of their time. However, if it's a situation where maybe the users are really busy, you don't have a lot of access to them, and maybe the budget's really tight, you can shorten it to 30 minutes to 45 minutes, but you just, will be getting less information out of it. And someone asked where we can download your interview guide. The resources will be linked within the PowerPoint, which will be shared afterwards. And how many interviews are enough? This will also be touched upon in the budget part. So these are all great questions. But really the cool thing about user interviews is that You don't need too many. I think it surprises people. The sweet spot can really be anywhere from 4 to 6 one-on-one user interviews. That Nisa Norman Foundation that I mentioned earlier, they're really leaders in the field in all things user experience. And they have found and done a lot of research on this, and they find that 4 to 6 interviews really cover 80% of the problems that might pop up. So you'll be covering, a vast majority of issues and have a lot of data to work with just, a few interviews. All right, awesome. Feel free to keep adding questions to the chat.
One more quick from Henry. How many questions should you ask during a user interview, or maybe like approximate length of an interview?
Yeah, I think that's one is a little bit trickier to answer because it's going to a little bit depend on the type of questions you're asking. Some of your questions might lead to a really long task that's being done. I don't know, you might ask someone to experience jumping into the pool with a Yeti, right? Like that's going to take longer than asking them to imagine it. So some of that you're going to have to play by ear as to how long you think it will take. One recommendation I have is be prepared for users to always answer longer than you expect and shorter than you expect. So you want to have a prioritized list and know which ones you can cut out. And you also want to have some backups if you run out of time. So these are great. Feel free to keep the chat questions coming. We're going to have another break at the end, but I want to make sure we get through the rest of the slides here. So you have your questions. You've done your interviews, let's say. How are we going to turn the interview notes into design decisions? So step 1 is turning raw data into analysis. These are a couple of steps that I follow. It's not an exact science, though. Every project is going to be a little bit different. Take the steps and modifications to this as you need it. As you do user research, you will become a little bit more comfortable with what that looks like. But some nice steps to follow is starting with highlighting key responses within your notes. So you should, either have handwritten notes or written notes. It is always recommended to try to get a recording of it and use exact quotes. So that goes back into avoiding bias. If you are taking notes and paraphrasing what is being said, you use those paraphrased responses in your analysis, you are now one step removed from what the user actually said. So try to pull exact quotes from recordings, or transcribe your interviews exactly, either using some sort of a technology online or spending the time to do it. Technologies are usually pretty good, so that can save a lot of time. Once you have those key responses figured out, you can turn them into virtual or real sticky notes. We'll go over that a little bit more in the next slide. And then you're going to group those sticky notes together into themes based off of commonalities. And then you're eventually going to use these themes to inform your final analysis and next steps. So what does this theming process look like? The official term for this is not theming. It is called Work Affinity Activity Diagram, or WAD, but that is a mouthful and doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me when you first hear it. So I like to call it theming. And basically it just means group-like things together. You're going to want to group it based off of pain points, likes, features, actions, anything like that. And then from there, you're going to use that, and you can reassess all the groups that you've made and group the groups together until you feel like you're at a point where you have a solid few key themes that you can point out and highlight to your key stakeholders. One thing I sometimes do is color code sticky notes per user interview. So each user has their own color. This is a screenshot of one of my boards that I have done in the past. I will warn you on color coding, don't always do it. I think there are cases where it's important for your users to remain anonymous. You can choose to not color code if you feel like maybe you're having a bias against a couple users. Maybe you thought their user interviews didn't go so well, or they were giving you bad responses. Don't color code it. You do not want to bias yourself into disregarding certain responses. It's also important to consider maybe sometimes where it's important to protect the identity of who's saying what from the end user. I mean, from your client or stakeholder. If it's, someone who's interacting with them frequently, they might be concerned about saying negative comments about the product. So that's something that you can talk about ahead of time and make that decision while you're doing your analysis. Use virtual or physical sticky notes. The sticky notes is honestly like a really, really great tool to do this. But I don't think it has to be physical. There are cons to that. Physical notes eventually go away, right? You're gonna have to take a picture of it or clear the space or something. And there's a lot of new technologies out here that are great for virtual ones. This is not sponsored. I wish it was, but I like to use Whimsical. It is free up to a certain point. So for any personal projects or small team projects, Whimsical is great. There's other tools out there like Miro or FigJam. So if you're familiar with Figma, they have their own little sticky note tool called FigJam. But yeah, basically this is what that step of analysis looks like. So once you have this, what to do from here? So you've organized your data, you've created your key themes, and now you want to put a priority to them. So think about what your users have said as a whole, think about your client's goals, take it all into consideration and put a priority to each of those. So you can label them as high, medium, or low. And then you also want to add a level of effort. You're seeing t-shirts here because there's a common technique in the industry called t-shirt sizing. And it's a way to just have at a really high level some estimations about what the level of effort is for each task. So this is a relatively small task to complete versus a relatively large task to complete. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's obviously not in depth, but it gives you a talking place to have with your clients or stakeholders about, how involved it is to achieve this key theme. So once you've prioritized and assigned a level of effort, you can create a really nice visual for them that's going to determine value. So if we start over here, we have our low effort and our high priority items. These I like to call as quick wins. I think they help keep stakeholders excited because you can create really manageable short-term goals and show a lot of value from them. Then you have your ones that are maybe a little bit higher effort. You have those large t-shirt sizes over here, but they're still really high priority. So you want to talk about those, and this is going to paint a future vision for the product. So something that is more of a long-term goal, or perhaps a fast follow after an initial release is done with those quick wins. Then you're going to have your ones that fall within this lower quadrant, which are the lower effort, but also low priority. These items, maybe you want to sprinkle in throughout. If you're having a slow moment in those long-term goals, maybe you can add in a few low effort items if it's important to show continual progress. Otherwise, you can put a pause on those. Then you have your last quadrant, which is high effort, low priority. And these are really things that you're going to want to say, let's put a pin in. Users don't seem that concerned about it. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm not saying it's not valuable, but it's just a lower priority and it's going to take a higher effort than what we want right now. So it's just simply a lower value. This graphic and visual can be a really nice way for you to talk to your stakeholders and clients and present something that is really easy to digest and can really help you to then turn it into an actionable roadmap for the future. So this is sort of how I turn that data, turn those answers into something manageable that I can talk about and make a plan and get my clients excited about what's to come. But I might still want to quantify my data even further. Sometimes a roadmap isn't enough to convince your clients. Even as pretty as it might be, as sound logic you might be using, they might still want certain things to happen in their way, in their order. This is where I think quantifying your data even further is really helpful. So one tool I do is to use percentages. So instead of saying, oh, a lot of your users said this, or some of your users said that, actually count up how many said it. So you could then say 75% of the users said they found your navigation confusing. This is a huge number. 75% sounds a lot worse than, oh, a lot of your users. That is a number that should alarm your clients or your stakeholders, and that's going to get them motivated to work with that. A caveat I'm going to add here is always remember to include your positives. If you present your clients with only negatives about their product, they might get really defensive. They might not want to hear it. It could be hard to find those positives sometimes. Sometimes user interviews really just come out with a ton of negatives. But if there's any way that you could twist something into like, hey, this is a success, like you're doing this well, you're going to want to like spurse those into your conversations just to keep it a little bit more positive and uplifting. Okay, so we're almost through this. And hopefully at this point, I've convinced you that user research is important and it's also manageable. Writing a script does not have to be scary or intimidating. It's something everyone can do. I think that there's often a lot of intimidation when it comes to user research, or maybe just unknown, where maybe it feels like training needs to be done or it's going to require so much money and time. And those things all help, of course, training, money, time, that's all fantastic. But it can really be done in what myself and a couple of my teammates like to call a more of a guerrilla warfare style. We are coming at it a little bit sneaky. You're fitting it into a few places. You're cutting down costs, and some research is better than no research. So with all of that, what is the hardest part of user research? Convincing your key stakeholders the value of it. So even with those percentages, even with that roadmap, they might still not want you to do the user research to begin with. So the ways you can combat that is to bring up the conversation early and as soon as possible. Talk to them about the importance and value of user research. There's a lot of research about research out there. Use that to your advantage. But don't just talk about it in general terms. Talk about it in terms that they're familiar with. So you can put it in terms of their money, their time, their products, their goals, and understand how it's going to be a return of investment for themselves and the value of that. And lastly, you're probably still going to meet resistance from time to time. So it's important that you're ready for that and flexible. Be ready to reduce scope and scale, switch to lower effort forms of research, which are those sort of other methods I talked about in the beginning briefly. That I do have a slide. I know we're running up on time here. So I do have a slide and some techniques to go over what those are and how to work within a budget. I talk specifically here about UX interviews, which is what we've been talking about today, focus groups and surveys. All of these are valuable and useful in their own time and place. Sometimes you can use focus groups and surveys as a way to reduce costs of user experience interviews. That's not to say they're less valuable. That's not to say that they aren't as important. They just might be better in other situations, but they can reduce time and money because it's less upfront effort for you. User experience interviews, they're one-on-one. That's pretty time consuming. That's pretty heavy. So I have some detailed information here, but for the sake of time, I won't go into it too much. But some of those questions you guys were asking earlier about how many do you need, how many people involved, how long, I've included some of that in here. Another thing that I have done for you all is talk through how you can decide what to use. So this is just a little example of a decision tree that you can kind of work through in your head of, you know, well, are they pushing for user research? Are they on board? Yes or no? And then from there, you can kind of decide, you know, are they going to allow me to have time for this in the roadmap? Are they going to allow for me to do this? Are they going to give me money for this? And all of those yes, no answers can lead you to a solution. Notice none of these say no user research. There's always a way to include it, even if it's just being sneaky. One tool to help you with that I also created is this like little quiz. A little disclaimer and caveat is this is simply a recommendation for you to use as a tool to start asking yourself questions and figuring out what user research is best for you. Every project is different. There are many, many factors to include beyond what's in this quiz. And your end result is just simply a recommendation. It might not be the best fit for your project, but it's a nice way to start thinking about how you can make those decisions. All right, so that's it. I'm gonna, I think we're at time, but if people have questions, I'm happy to stick around and talk through some things.
We had a question earlier, if you don't work for a company, let's say, that has a team or a tool to, where can you recruit people for your research?
Yes, that's a great question. So there are a couple avenues you can go through. For some things like client projects, they typically would know a couple of users that you might be able to reach out to. Maybe in some situations, it's those users that are always calling them on customer support. They just have their contact information. Other times, your users are actually going to be your stakeholders. So in those sort of client meetings that you have, that's where you can be sneaky and make that user research. You can turn that into what you need. If you don't know who to interview, and if you don't know how to access those people, work together with the client or stakeholder to figure out how you can access them. And if you still can't figure out how to get face-to-face time about it, you can use tools like SurveyMonkey to get a feel for who would be willing to fall into that group. There are more expensive tools like user testing that are really awesome. They're just really expensive, that give you a population of people who are willing to participate in research. But SurveyMonkey is a really great option. You could do your research through surveys in SurveyMonkey, or you could maybe try to get some people to respond in SurveyMonkey to get a feel for who would be willing to follow up with a user interview afterwards. So sometimes you might have to be scrappy and creative, but there is always ways to figure it out. Oh, and lastly, you can always use friends and family. If they fit the target population, use them. But, I think take it with a grain of salt, and that's a last resort.
Excellent. Any other questions for Caitlin?
All right. It
This
doesn't.
is great, Caitlin. Thank you.
Thank you. So it doesn't seem like I have any other takers at the time. So I will wrap it up and say thank you. You can feel free to connect with me. Once you get the slide deck, I have my email here. You can also connect with me through LinkedIn. I've also posted a link to the company that I work for. This Connect With link is actually going to take you to the opening positions that we have right now. We have a bunch of opening slots, but ones that might be of most interest to the group here are the junior designers or the senior designer positions. But yeah, feel free to get in touch and ask any follow-up questions you have, or even if you just want to talk through this a little bit more. Thank you all to everyone who turned on your camera, everyone who volunteered. You really made this super fun for me, and you all had great questions and ideas. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Thanks everybody for participating this evening. We hope you found the workshop enlightening. As always, you can visit NoVA on meetup.com to learn about future events. We have them scheduled through November, and then we're also setting up December, which is an in-person event, and January, which will probably not be. So those will all be coming soon. Also, our YouTube channel has videos from our previous events going back a whole bunch of years. If you're interested in giving a talk or a panel or a workshop, please reach out to us. We're scheduling well in advance. We'd love to talk with you. And until then, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you at a future event. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you.